You grew up calling people on a phone attached to a wall. Then one day, you didn't. And somehow, you handled it like it was nothing. But here's the question nobody ever asks. What did that actually do to you? Not to society, not to technology, to you, to the way you think, the way you trust people, the way you lie awake at 3 in the morning wondering if you've made the right choices. Because if you were born somewhere between 1976 and 1985, you didn't just witness one of the biggest shifts in human history. You absorbed it, right in the middle of becoming who you are. And most people have never stopped to think about what that really means. Let me paint you a picture. It's a Friday night, sometime in the early 90s. You're a teenager. You've made plans to meet your friends at a specific place, at a specific time. And then you leave the house. And that's it. No one can reach you. No one knows exactly where you are. Your parents have a rough idea. The mall, maybe, or someone's house. But the details are fuzzy, and somehow everybody is okay with that. You show up. Your friends show up. Or sometimes they don't. And you wait for 20 minutes and then go home, and you call them later, and they say sorry. Something came up, and life moves on. That world required something of you that we don't really have a word for anymore. A kind of low-grade faith. You trusted that people would show up not because you could track them in real time, but because that's just what people did. Plans were sacred in a way they aren't now, because canceling meant actually telling someone you weren't coming, looking them in the eye later, explaining yourself. You also remember a specific feeling that most people under 30 have never experienced. The feeling of being genuinely unreachable, walking out of your house and existing completely in a physical world for hours at a time with no notifications, no messages, no pings. Just you and wherever you were and whatever was happening in front of you. And then, almost overnight, that changed. You were in your early 20s when the internet stopped being a novelty and started being the air. You watched everyone get cell phones. You signed up for Friendster, and then MySpace, and then Facebook, and somehow none of it felt threatening or overwhelming. It just felt like the next thing. You learned it the way you'd learned everything else in your life, by doing it, by figuring it out as you went. But here's the thing nobody talks about. You also remembered what came right before. And that memory has shaped you in ways that are much deeper than a preference for texting over calling or knowing what a dial-up modem sounds like. Psychologists have been quietly studying a specific group of people born in that narrow window between the mid-70s and the mid-80s. And what they keep finding is that this group doesn't behave quite like Gen X and doesn't behave quite like millennials either. Researchers started calling them Xennials around 2014. Some sociologists prefer the term microgeneration, which is a more clinical way of saying this slice of history was so specific, so distinct in what it produced, that the usual generational categories just don't hold. And the reason comes down to something happening inside your brain during those years. Here's the simple version. The human brain isn't fully developed until roughly your mid-20s. There's a part right behind your forehead, the prefrontal cortex, that handles decision-making, understanding consequences, learning complex new patterns, and adapting to change. And during your late teens and early 20s, that part is still in high-speed construction. It's more flexible, more open to rewiring than it will ever be again. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, which really just means your brain was still wet clay. Now, think about what happened to Xennials during that exact window. You didn't just experience a new piece of technology. You experienced the complete restructuring of how human beings communicate, how they access information, how they form relationships, how they remember their own lives. The entire operating system of modern social existence got swapped out while your brain was in its most formative, most receptive state. And you were old enough to remember the previous version. That's the part that makes all the difference. Your brain absorbed both worlds during the years it was most capable of deep learning, which means you didn't have to consciously choose to understand analog life and digital life. You lived both of them, and they're both wired into you in a way that isn't really voluntary. It's not a skill you developed. It's a second language you learned as a child. It's just there, running quietly in the background, shaping how you see things without you even realizing it. And this shows up in your life in ways that are surprisingly specific. You probably have an unusual relationship with privacy. You came of age in a world where your embarrassing moments weren't documented. That terrible haircut, that relationship that ended messily, that night you'd rather not think about. None of it was photographed and posted and permanently searchable. It just happened, and then it lived in the soft, shifting landscape of human memory, which is actually the way memory was designed to work. Here's something genuinely interesting about how we store the past. Our brains are not recording devices. They're editors. Every time you remember something, your brain is actually reconstructing it, filling in gaps, adjusting details slightly based on who you are now, what you need the story to mean. This is not a flaw. This is how human beings process, experience, and grow from it. The rough edges soften. The context shifts. You become a slightly different person, and the memory quietly updates itself to reflect that. But when everything is permanently documented, that natural editing process gets interrupted. You're not allowed to remember things differently than they happened. The photo is still there. The post is still there. The receipt, as people say now, is always there. And that creates a relationship with your own history that is fundamentally more rigid, more prosecutorial, less forgiving. You grew up before that, which means your past is actually yours in a way that younger generations' pasts maybe aren't. Your memories evolved into stories, and your stories got to become wisdom instead of staying frozen as evidence. But here's where we have to slow down, because it's not all psychological advantage. Most conversations about Xennials stay in the comfortable zone. Oh, you're so adaptable. Oh, you have the best of both worlds. And while that's true in some ways, it misses something that matters. A lot of you hit your late 20s and early 30s right around 2008. And for those who don't remember, or who were too young to feel it, 2008 was not a blip. The global financial crisis wiped out savings, eliminated jobs, collapsed industries, and fundamentally changed what economic security meant for an entire generation of people who were right in the middle of trying to build their lives. And this is where the psychology gets heavier and more honest. When people experience significant financial trauma, job loss, instability, the sudden disappearance of what felt like solid ground, during the years when they're supposed to be establishing themselves, the effects don't just go away when things improve. The research on this is clear. Your brain learns from threat. And when a threat arrives during a formative period, during the years when you're building your foundational assumptions about how safe the world is and how much you can rely on stability, it doesn't just create a memory. It creates a lens, a quiet, almost invisible lens through which you evaluate every decision that involves risk, money, security, or trust in the future. You might not even notice it operating. Maybe it shows up as an unwillingness to make large financial commitments, even when you can afford them. Maybe it's a low hum of anxiety that never quite names itself. Maybe it's the way you save compulsively, or the way you can't fully relax in the good times because some part of you is always braced for things to collapse again. And if any of that sounds familiar, I want to say something clearly. That is not a character flaw. That is not you being pessimistic or anxious or broken. That is what happens when real instability meets a developing sense of self. You learn something true, that things can fall apart, during the years when you were still deciding what you believed about the world. Of course it stayed with you. Of course it shaped you. That's not weakness. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. So what you have, if you're a Xennial, is this unusual combination that the generational conversation almost never accounts for. You have the adaptability that came from navigating a total technological transformation during your most neurologically flexible years. You have the self-reliance that came from a childhood where parents didn't hover, where boredom was a problem you solve yourself, where independence was assumed rather than negotiated. You have a nuanced relationship with both technology and human presence, because you remember what it felt like before the two were constantly competing with each other. And underneath all of that, in a lot of cases, you have this low, persistent undercurrent of economic vigilance. A memory in your body more than in your mind of what it felt like when stability turned out to be an illusion. That combination is genuinely unusual, and it creates this specific paradox that a lot of Xennials carry without quite having words for. You are independent, but you understand cooperation. You are skeptical, but you're not cynical. You can disappear into digital life, but you also know, in a way that isn't theoretical, that there's something on the other side of the screen that a screen can never fully replace. And you probably feel, at least some of the time, like you don't quite belong anywhere. Not fully Gen X, not really millennial. Too old to have grown up online, too young to write technology off as someone else's problem. Caught between two complete worlds with a fluent accent in both. Here's what I want you to hear about that. The feeling of not quite fitting is not the absence of an identity. It is your identity. The in-between is not a waiting room. It is the actual place you live. And living there, being shaped by transition itself, gave you something that is quietly, genuinely valuable. Because here's the truth that most generational content glosses over. We're living in a world that is going to keep changing. Faster, not slower. The people who will navigate that well are not the ones who grew up entirely comfortable in one paradigm. They're the ones who have already been through a version of this, who already know in their bones that the world they grew up in is not the world they have to stay in, who can carry something from the past forward without being trapped by it. Xennials already did that once, already lived through the moment when the entire landscape changed and had to figure out who they were on the other side of it without a map, without a model, without any older generation to look to and say, how did you handle this? Because no generation had handled this before. You made it up as you went, and you're still here. You know what it felt like to wait for a letter, for a phone call, for a person to actually show up. You know what it felt like to be bored enough that your mind had to make its own entertainment. You know what it felt like to make a mistake that didn't live forever on the internet. And you also know how to build a life in a world that never stops accelerating. What was lost deserves to be named honestly. The ability to be alone with your thoughts without effort. The patience that came from having no other option. The presence that existed when the present moment was the only place you could be. Those things weren't nothing, and you don't have to pretend they were. But you're also someone who adapted. Not because you had to tell yourself to, not because you followed a self-help framework, because that's what you actually did under real pressure in real time. And that happened inside you at a cellular level in a way that doesn't really go away. The Xennial experience is worth understanding not because it makes you superior to any other generation. It doesn't. Every generation carries its own particular kind of weight, its own particular kind of gift. But yours is specific enough and overlooked enough that it deserves to actually be seen. You're not a failed Gen Zer. You're not an early millennial. You're not between two things. You're the thing itself, a generation shaped by transition, which turns out to be one of the most useful things a person can be shaped by. If something in this landed for you, if you recognize yourself in some of what we talked about, I'd genuinely love it if you subscribed. This channel is about understanding human behavior in a way that actually makes sense, not clinical, not oversimplified, just honest and human. There's a lot more coming that I think you'll find worth your time. I'll see you in the next one.